You're listening to a podcast from EvidenceNetwork.ca, making evidence matter in Canadian health policy.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us back this afternoon to the Evidence Network Symposium. I'm very pleased this afternoon to have three of our media experts to talk to you about what the media world is like in Canada right now. I have Bob Capps, who is the publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press, but today he's wearing the hat of the chair of News Media Canada. I have Jennifer Ditchburn, who is with Policy Options, and I have Andre Picard, who is one of the few health columnists and dedicated health experts left in Canada. He works, of course, with the Globe and Mail as an amazing expert, an amazing resource. We'll start just in the order of which they appear. Bob Cox will start with a sort of generalized overall view of newspapers. Jennifer will speak, and then Andre will provide his perspective. So go ahead, and then by the way, there'll be time afterwards for you to ask as many questions as you wish. So we'll start with Bob. Go ahead, guys.
Sure. Thank you, Shannon. I'm glad to be here today with all of you. I'm actually going to be wearing both hats. I'm going to talk using very specific examples from Winnipeg, but I am chair of News Media Canada, which represents all daily and community newspapers across the country. So that's between 800 and 900 newspapers, and about a little less than 100 of those are daily newspapers. So it's a broad representation of newspapers across the country. I started in journalism quite some time ago, as you can probably tell. It was 1984 when I went to work at the Winnipeg Free Press for the first time. I went in January of 1984. Now, I actually don't recommend moving to Winnipeg in January. And I like Winnipeg, and usually I'm quite sensitive to cold jokes. But when I started, the publisher was a fellow by the name of Don Nichols. Don's day basically consisted of coming in the morning, and around 11:30 he would head off to the Manitoba Club, which is a private men's club, or used to be a private men's club. I think they've allowed women now. But anyway, back then it was a private men's club that he would go to at 11:30 in the morning and have 2 martinis, and then have a bottle of red wine with lunch. And then usually by the time he got through the bottle of red wine with lunch, he decided he'd go home for the day and wouldn't come back to work. And that was the life of a publisher in 1984. He didn't have to come back to work because the newspaper was doing so well that he didn't have to really watch the till very much. I mean, on Saturdays we published 200,000 copies of the newspaper, and we had at least 2 sections full of classified advertising, and you couldn't stop the money from coming in. So I can tell you, having been the publisher now for 10 years, that life's a little bit different for publishers today. They don't give me a membership to the Manitoba Club anymore. It's because of all the changes you all know about, right? The great digital disruption, which is the great disruption of our lifetimes in media, and it's really what it means for newspapers is a very different presence, a very different way of operating. Essentially, over the past decade, newspapers have lost about half their revenues. From about 2006 to today, they've lost about half of the revenues they once had. To give you a sort of specific example of the Winnipeg Free Press, I was named publisher in 2007, and my first budget that I prepared a revenue budget of around $128 million, and this year the one I'm working on right now is going to be around 75, so not quite half, but pretty close. So, and I'm still trying to do the same thing, by the way, with $75 million that I did with $128 million. The one difference is I'm not actually paying the shareholders any money because nobody's making any money on the newspaper anymore. The Free Press is somewhat fortunate in our ownership, in that our owners have opted a couple of years ago to stop taking money out of the newspaper, so we can actually survive fairly well, or I shouldn't say fairly well. That's a too robust a term for the newspaper industry these days, but we can survive without the worries that some other newspaper companies may have that you may have heard about. So it really means, of course, that editorial budgets have been slashed alongside all the other expense reductions. Again, our newsroom is about half the size it was 15 years ago or so. When I joined, there was about 120 editorial employees. I initially went back to the Winnipeg Free Press in 2005 as the editor, and there were about 120 editorial employees at that time. And now there's well, I think on paper there's 67, but I think when you look at all the absences and things, it's probably closer to 60. So it's about half what it was at that time. The opinion department of the Free Press has an august past. It was at one time led by John Defoe, who was sort of a legendary editor of the early part of the 20th century, and who was, sort of led opinion across the country and this sort of thing. And it's sort of this tradition, by the time I had arrived, was down. There was an editorial chief. There were 3 editorial writers, and there was a clerical person who helped with letters and things like this. Today, we just have 1 person in our opinion department. So that's common. That's not unusual for newspapers across the country. Now, Andre, of course, works for the Globe. The Globe is a little different, being that it's a national paper and has still put more resources into opinion. But in terms of your average metro paper, that's pretty common these days. Shannon used to be the editorial director at the Free Press. I think she has how many employees? 3?
3 now.
3 and a half, and now that's just 1 person. Yeah. Now here's the weird thing, though. So we've gone through this shrinking period with newspapers, and the one thing that hasn't shrunk is our audience. We still reach as many people, or in many cases more people, than we used to. And it's because, of course, of the digital revolution, and because we can reach people in so many different ways. And for many of us, our digital audiences are actually now larger than our printed audiences. So when you think, I always hate the term newspaper, but I haven't come up with a better term yet. The newspapers are really news outlets, and generally are reaching people more digitally, and through various other the extensions of the digital platform through social media, et cetera. There's some beeping going on. Is everything okay there? Somebody hasn't hung up. There's a beep, beep, beep going on. Is there?
No, it's okay. It's actually coming through one of the people that's dialed in online, so I'm just going to communicate with them and let them know that.
I see. Okay, sure. Yeah. So that we have this paradox that we have fewer resources to create content, and yet we're still reaching an audience just as large or larger. Like in Winnipeg, I have Vividata, which is the survey organization that surveys newspaper and magazine audiences across the country, came out with stats this week, and I noticed that ours in Winnipeg, we reached about 64% of the population. When I first started, we reached 67%. Population has grown. We've reached more people today than we did 12 years ago. That's just in the Winnipeg market. Of course, our market has become extended. What we find is that we reach Winnipeggers all over the world because we watch it and we see hot spots. Phoenix, I have to tell you, is the hottest spot generally for reaching Winnipeggers in the wintertime, but you do reach your audience around the world all the time. So it sort of creates a situation where newspapers are looking for content outside the way they used to get content. I mean, it used to be, we used to have newsrooms full of experts, right? We'd have a labor expert, we'd have health experts, usually more than one health expert, by the way. We'd have somebody who was an expert in the law, et cetera, et cetera. When I was a young reporter, I covered nothing but justice issues, but the courts basically is all I covered. And there's less and less of that. Editorial boards would have people who would be experts in areas, and they would invite experts in. And typically, the way journalists would work is that the transfer of knowledge would take place by an expert journalist in an area, interviewing the people who are doing research, coming up with knowledge, developing knowledge, and then that would be transferred through articles, et cetera, in media. It doesn't happen less and less and less these days. Because newspapers don't have the staff to develop expertise, so they don't have a whole group of contacts they might contact if they were writing on any particular subject. Most of the journalists writing tend not to have a background in any particular subject. Newspapers themselves are looking for sources of content that are, well, how can I put this? Free. It's actually a bit of a scary situation in some cases because there are a lot of organizations that will offer content to you as a news organization. Give you, in some cases, as a journalist, I'm kind of appalled. Where you have, I'll give you an example from Winnipeg, where the guy who essentially does public relations for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers writes a column in the local daily Metro newspaper, which is the free handout newspaper in Winnipeg. And so that's not journalism, that's public relations. Like if the football team is paying for the story on the football team, then that is public relations, right? And there are lots of organizations that are willing and able to do that these days, put information out there. When it comes to more sort of on the policy side of things, you have organizations like the Fraser Institute that will gladly provide content for you if you want. What you have trouble finding is reliable, independent, fact-based content that is not putting forward some paid-for side of things, be it ideological, be it commercial, or whatever. There's obviously lots of large corporations that would be happy to provide content too on how good it is to drink Pepsi-Cola at breakfast. But anyway, it's really I think it's a reality that you're going to have fewer paid journalists working in traditional media organizations. That's just reality. It goes across. It's not just newspapers. It's generally across all news media. And so what we've really got to is a stage where you have a fundamental shift in the way content is created for media. And that shift is the shift is towards more the onus being on the researchers, the people who are doing the work, developing the knowledge, actually being responsible for not only just doing the research and doing it within their own research communities, but putting it out into the general public. I think that's a very crucial part of doing research now. Because first of all, there's already, as I've described, there's already audience for it. There's already take-up for it in news media outlets, particularly newspapers, as I'm talking about that. But there's also, you can sort of think about it as to whether it's part of the responsibility of any kind of publicly funded research to go beyond just doing the research and actually getting it out into the public. Because it's unlikely that the news media will become knocking at your door. It will happen sometimes, but it's unlikely these days. Just again, a question of resources. What else do I have here? I think that now I've lost my track here. Here we go. There's also sort of I mentioned the availability of content from sources that you may not want to use. It's important that there be credible organizations that are seen to be credible putting out information or funneling information into the public, because we live in the age of fake news, right? And I'm not talking about NBC or anyone else Donald Trump may attack, but generally. There's a lot of misinformation that's going to be out there, and it's a reality that we live with now in the digital age. The case of the Las Vegas shooter, I mean, the first stories about the Las Vegas shooter, his personal background basically described him as a Democrat who voted for Hillary Clinton, right? And there's still stories out there that say that, because it's totally false, by the way, but that was put out there by right-wing groups in the United States, and they didn't care whether it was true. It was just put out there. It was sort of like that. So what you need is sort of independent organizations that can verify what they're putting out there, and that people come to trust, that they get name recognition as a trustworthy source, because people are becoming much more aware of fake news and would like to avoid it. But the great thing about fake news is that you can shape it in any way you want and disguise it in any way you want and use it for whatever purposes you want. So as an organization, it's important to become known and credible and maintain that credibility to sort of, again, get access to where there's a demand for this information to reach members of the public. And we still know, by the way, about our audience, that some of the key readers, some of the key consumers of the content that we put out are the opinion makers. Like the people who always tell me they read the newspaper are always people in politics, people who are in business, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the audiences to whom our content is still the most important, because they still rely on it. The kind of the loss of readership or the disaggregation of the audiences that's often discussed it really is sort of amongst the great multitudes. The key people that we reach, we still reach them, as I said, as well or better better than ever. But I guess what I'm saying from a newspaper point of view is that we need help to do this. We need help to continue putting out content, and we rely on organizations that can provide it to us. The healthier those organizations are, the better off the whole public debate will be, or the whole public knowledge will be about research that's done. So I can stop now and
All right.
move on. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Bob. Next is Jennifer Ditchburn then, and she'll take it from there. Go ahead, Jennifer.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here today. We're obviously allied quite closely with the Evidence Network because Policy Options publishes, as I think the Winnipeg Free Press does as well, articles that come from the Evidence Network in both English and French, so which is great for us because we put a high priority on publishing in both languages. So before coming here today, I was thinking about Bob because Bob and I worked together more than 20 years ago in Edmonton. And this was the beginning of my career, and Bob was the news editor, but I was thinking about what life was like in the Edmonton Bureau, or the Prairie Bureau of the Canadian Press at the time. And so we didn't have individual laptops. None of us had cell phones. You might have had a cell phone.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe like one of those big ones that gave you cancer. And we, as Canadian press reporters, other than occasionally gathering audio, we were basically writing stories. It was great. No distractions. I remember there was one terminal in the back of the office for the internet. And I might have been the only person with an email address at the time, Hotmail. Yeah, I still have Hotmail. And the only thing older than that would maybe be AOL account. But at any rate, I think back to those times, they could seem kind of like the salad days of journalism. Every one of the outlets in Edmonton had a ledge reporter. There was money news outlets had money to send people not just out of province, but overseas and do investigative work and so on. True story, I replaced someone at the ledge one day, the ledge reporter, and I met my husband there, so there was even better things about those days. But I actually think, sometimes we can overstate how good things were back 20 years ago. For one thing, and I'll name a couple of reasons why I think that there are good parts to where we are now in journalism, is the access that we have now to research and data and to experts. So before, a lot of reporters on their desk, they would have this pseudo phone book called Sources, and it was, and a Rolodex. But the Sources thing came out every year. You had to buy it as a subscription, and it had every industry association or special interest group listed with their media person and the description of what they were. And of course, it would get horribly out of date all the time. You had to buy it every year, and there'd be stacks of old sources in the newsroom that would just go in the bin. So you think about that, and you think about now. I mean, I can find, I'm preparing right now a series on peacekeeping policy, just as an example. But I can search the waterfront around the entire world and ask experts to write pieces for us. I can look at data. I can, through different accounts that we have at the Institute, read any academic journal that I want for backup information. All of this would have taken so much time when I was starting out my career. So in that sense, I think that we've, there are good points, and I'll get to some of the bad points in a little bit, to where we are right now. The other area I think that where things have changed a lot is obviously with the position of women in newsrooms. When it came to Parliament Hill in 1997, after the 97 election, women were still not in any of the top reporting jobs. There were a few, but mostly those were all occupied by men. All the senior positions were occupied by men. And in doing some historical research in the press gallery, it might surprise you, it might not surprise you, but even leading up to into the 70s. So from the time the gallery started in 1866 through to the 60s, you might have had 3 maximum women at any one time in the press gallery. And that's when the gallery was continuing to grow exponentially. Not until the 70s and 80s, and then when I arrived in the 90s is really when we saw the numbers of women really go up. Now, thankfully, there are zero chief correspondents who are women and so on. But diversity in newsrooms is still a really hard nut to crack. And one of the changes that I think that's been positive for journalism is social media. And I think because social media, although there's many negatives, which I think we can all identify, the distraction to reporters, the misogyny, and the racism, and everything else. But at the same time, social media has lifted a mirror to traditional media, legacy media, to say, hey, look at the inherent biases you have in your coverage. I think it's caused also newsrooms to realize just how homogenous they are. And in particular, and I'll say in the last 22 years I've been working professionally, I never once worked with an Indigenous person in any newsroom. And now I work with Indigenous people almost on a weekly basis as contributors. So I think there's interesting currents that are happening with the arrival of social media and so on. And it's not just social media that's contributed to some real shifts in the media, but also there's new media players that have come, new digital media players that I think are also putting a healthy pressure on traditional media. So I'm thinking about in Canada, Discourse Media, or the Tyee, the National Observer, different places that are, I think, again, causing some more reflection, let's say, on how the media has focused on different issues, who's doing the reporting, and how they can better address some of the issues of diversity in the newsroom. But as Bob, I thought, really he covered it very well. We can't overstate or understate the problems, the financial difficulties that are happening in journalism. Obviously, I have a lot of time for organizations like the Canadian Press and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Winnipeg Free Press, and Globe and Mail, for all the investment that they've put into quality reporting and standards and good editing and all this. And this is where I think an organization like the Evidence Network is well placed to fill in some of the gaps. So even though, and you address this, even though there's these terrible financial struggles that the industry is facing, there's new opportunities for organizations that can step in to help where the newsrooms are unable to cover certain areas. So in journalism theory, we talk about information subsidies, which I think you were getting at. And in the past, it was viewed as, okay, well, press releases were an information subsidy. So if you didn't have enough people in your newsroom, you could reconfigure a press release and put it out, and that subsidized your newsroom effectively. But I think we're getting information subsidies in different ways and not necessarily negative ways. And so, and this is my stock and trade now in policy options. I publish exclusively, almost exclusively, research experts, academics, public policy experts, bureaucrats, former politicians, and so on areas of public policy. And so I think now we're able to rely on experts, go to the source, and without using some of the, for better or for worse, some of the filters, I think that at times might have been negative aspects of journalism, of what we did in journalism. Since I left daily reporting and went to policy options, I feel that I'm seeing the media landscape a lot differently. And I see the competition now for expert analysis, which is really fascinating. I don't know if you've noticed this in your just reading in your daily life, but now I'm not the only player that's vying for the expert in security or intelligence, or on the aging population, or on the charter challenges, the potential charter challenges for Quebec's Bill 62. I'm in competition with the Globe and the Winnipeg Free Press, and the CBC, and the Conversation, and a number of other outlets that are equally interested in going to the source and publishing expert analysis and critiques and information. So just going back a little bit, for a long time, we needed journalists to filter and translate the research of others. And I think this is an important part. And also, I think that for a long time, we had journalists speak for others or offer their opinions on issues that affected other people. Whereas now, what I see as a big positive is rather than have some of a very homogenous newsroom having people offer their opinions on issues for which they really don't know much about, and I put Indigenous issues at the top. Why not go to the Indigenous person themselves to write about from their perspective and from their expertise base on an issue of public policy or politics or what have you. So those are some of the shifts that I think that are quite positive. All this being said, we still need quality journalism, and we still need those standards that I was talking about. And mobilizing expert knowledge requires the ability to translate complicated language, bring context, and introduce different story techniques. But the end products of that process, where you can bring together journalistic organizations and people from the research community or the nonprofit community, the end product can be quite wonderful. And I see that we're reaching together, reaching all kinds of different audiences, wider audiences that are now very interested in long reads and tapping into what before might have been completely inaccessible. And I think some of you might be aware of the low numbers of people who actually read academic journals. I think there is some study that said maximum of 7 people, or an average of 7. So, we're getting thousands of people now reading what was once in an academic journal but was rewritten for policy options or for the Evidence Network. So another positive area. And let me say that I think that, and those of you that are with government might have a particular point of view, but I think that we're at a critical time in the sense that the federal government, at any rate, is looking for input and looking to listen and consulting and engaging. At least they tell me that. People I talk to, PCO and so on, they recognize that they don't have the policy capacity on every issue. I mean, I would say artificial intelligence is a great example. It's very hard to have experts in an area that's just emerging. And so we get feedback from our contributors quite often that saying that they were approached by a federal department to come in and talk to them, or they were asked to provide more information or be part of a consultation. And so that's where we feel that we're, at Policy Options at any rate, having a real impact in the broader public policy process. And so the last thing I'll say, because I feel like I've been going on for a long time, but some of the things that we're reflecting on at Policy Options, which is relevant to the Evidence Network and perhaps to all of you, is that the landscape is always shifting, and we're constantly trying to figure out where readers are and how they get our information. And so we experiment and we experiment. So we have a podcast, we have a newsletter, a weekly newsletter. So if you missed some of our content during the week, you can get this newsletter on Saturday morning and go through it. We're on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook. That whole process is very interesting because you see different networks of people light up. So I find that really rewarding. You have an article and then you see it shared multiple times by different people who are interconnected through social media. But we constantly have to have a reflection on whether the storytelling techniques we're using are effective. Can we mobilize knowledge in different ways? Infographics or data visualization, even for articles that you wouldn't expect. So even the type of submissions that we have, how can we use that? This week we had a meeting back in Montreal with our team, and we talked about, well, Instagram, we had previously dismissed Instagram as not quite in line with dry public policy issues. I don't think they're dry, but we're revisiting that because so many students, even PhD students, are on Instagram, and maybe it's another way of reaching people who are interested in public policy but are really into the latest social media platforms. Snapchat might be a bridge too far, but we'll see. Things change very quickly. So I'll leave it at that. I'll just say it's kind of it can seem depressing when you consider the struggles that the media are going through right now, but can also be sort of exciting because we're in a period of experimentation and great creativity. And so for me, at any rate, where I am, it's very dynamic time and something that keeps me interested every day. Oh. That's great. Thank you. Brendan, last but not least.
So you heard from the publisher and an editor, so now you'll hear from a grunt, frontline reporter. And seeing we were doing disclosures about our past, Bob and I were editors at rival newspapers many years ago at our universities. He was editor of the Charlatan at Carleton, and I was at the Fulcrum at Louisville. And when we had dinner last night, we realized that was almost 40 years ago, so that didn't make us feel any younger. So that's my full disclosure. So I thought I'd talk from the perspective of reporter, columnist. You heard all the business problems, lack of money, etc. For me, it's more of a lack of space, the lack of time. Those are the issues. That's what the money translates into for reporters. So we used to have a lot more time to do a story because, again, we're from I started in the pre-internet, pre-laptop era, and at times you started your story in the morning, and you had till the evening to write it and chat on the phone with people. It's all very leisurely. Unlike the publishers, we didn't go get drunk until after 2. So that was different. But so that's what's changed. The time pressures are dramatically different. Now there's this real obsession with getting things first and not necessarily best or correct. And I think that's a real downside of the media. We've failed readers in many ways that way because we're just so obsessed with. I've never met a reader who cares if I get the story half an hour before and it is correctly. I've never met anyone who ever cared about that. So we kind of obsessed. The other part that you heard from Bob about this is this loss of people like me, beat reporters. So when I started, our newsroom was full of everybody has specialty. And we're just a handful of general reporters. And we had an entire team of policy, medicine, social welfare, labor, all these huge teams of people who did that. At one point, we had 5 people doing health reporting. So that's really changed. Now everybody sort of gets thrown into the pool, and you expect you to do anything anytime. Now I'm an exception. I'm spoiled, but I thought that I am a dying breed, literally and figuratively. And I think that's unfortunate. I think our paper is kind of struggling with that. Do we hang on to it or not? And kind of clinging to a few beats because they're popular with our readers. But I don't know how much longer that'll last. I'm not sure that I'll be replaced by someone with the beats, to be honest. But I'm going to be around for a long time. So hopefully. I'm going down with the ship. So I guess the issue for me is, as we said, we have a lot of readers. I have way more readers than I've ever had. There's no question. I'm more aware of them because of social media. I get lots more feedback, which is good sometimes, depending on who's giving it. But it's this contrast you're struck with every day. More and more readers and less ability to do your job, less money, and people suffering, etc. So it's an odd paradox. And I think a lot of our problems are self-inflicted in the media. I think we really made a mistake of giving away our product when the internet started. I can say that because I'm not in management, but I think that it is pretty else. To be honest, just, I didn't take the internet seriously when it came along. Thought, we'll just give our product, we'll always sell ads, etc. And I don't think anyone recognizes how dramatic the shift would be. And now we're kind of trying to put the genie back in the bottle, in place, trying to introduce paywalls of different sorts. And Winnipeg Free Press has a really interesting one where we gave 27 cents for an article.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting. The Globe is really pushing subscriptions. If you're a Globe reader, you'll see there's more and more, we call it red content, so only available to subscribers. And then every time I have a red story, I get angry emails from people, how dare you have a paywall? And I actually have something that I just use as so I don't have to retype it every time. And I send it to people. I say, do you complain about the coffee paper? That's always my answer to someone who complains about it. I don't know any business that gives away a product that really accepts journalism. And I think that I've seen, I don't want to sound like an arch capitalist, but it doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't have any time for people who complain about the paywall. So don't ask that question. I'm not, even though I'm a journalist, I'm not overly negative or cynical about the future of journalism. I think there is some really interesting stuff when we figure it out. I think it could be really interesting. Again, my paper, we're lucky. I think we're kind of up here. We're thinking of it, the boat's thinking this way, and we're kind of up here. So not as bad. But where I see the future going is we're leaving increasingly the quick hits, the news to the web, and doing that stuff essentially for anybody can do that. And we're investing more and more in big projects, in analysis, in opinion pieces, because people will pay for that. When we do these, we do 2 big projects a year at the Globe, and we internally essentially bid on them. We put forward our ideas, and we try and get our bosses to fund our project, and 1 or 2 get chosen. But when those things run, things like Unfounded last year, a really interesting project about sexual assault and how police treat it. Those things sell papers, and we have to, Bob will know this, they can track exactly what article is someone reading before they bought a subscription. And we get memos on the C-tweet, which I delete without reading. But apparently those series actually generate a lot of subscriptions, so that's why we keep doing them, and I think we'll do more and more. So that's interesting. And I think it's a reminder, too, that to me, good journalism is better than it's ever been. Like the series we do now are spectacular. We did in the 80s, we did kind of slapdash. And, there's a lot of effort to get background and fill it in as we went along. We did a lot more follow-up and a lot less stuff up front. So I think the good journalism now is better than ever. And the bad journalism is worse than it's ever been. With listicles and shit like that. And unfortunately, people click on that. With being money for someone, and we're kind of obsessed with clicks. I kind of have I write about social health issues. I kind of have a social analysis of the media that it's a reflection of a larger society where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And I'm lucky enough to work with one of the rich organizations, the Globe. But to me, the most troubling thing is not that papers like the Globe are cutting back. It's that small town papers are disappearing. I was brought up in a small town in Northern Ontario. Those papers are total rags now. There's nothing to them. And if I wanted to be corrupt, I think I'd be a small town mayor now. And that to me is the most troubling part of journalism. Like society, the middle has fallen out. You have the really rich and the really poor, and that's very true in journalism. I think we have to figure out the wealthy, the New York Times, the Washington Post, how we're going to help bridge that gap to the local journalism. We all lose with it. Let me share a few thoughts about the evidence networks of the world, from what my thoughts are worth. Again, as a reporter, as a columnist, I actually have mixed feelings about it. To impart something like Evidence Network is, they're cutting my grass, right? This is my business. I get paid to write opinion pieces. And I thought, why would my bosses continue to pay me if they can get stuff with equal or better quality for free? I think it kind of bothers me to a certain degree. Now, the flip side of that is I think these organizations like Evidence Network are a really good way of getting more variety, different points of view in into our newspapers and into our newsroom. One of the really real tragedies of not having any money is we don't hire young people. So we have a lot of old white men like me who dominate our newsroom. And we recognize it's a problem, but the solution isn't an easy one. Short of all of us throwing ourselves on the sword and leaving space for new people. And I think that's concerning. So if we can get more variety, more better demographic representation, more Indigenous voices, they should be in our newsroom, but they won't. And again, we have to find a way to get them in our newsroom. At the Globe, we had a fellowship where we had an Indigenous reporter in for a year. But that's not the solution. The solution is to hire them. We let them go after the fellowship. And we have to figure that out too, to be more reflective of our society. I think too, we have to be conscious of the fact that if academics are writing, it's going to be an elite writing. That's been the problem in media, and we have to be get more voices. I think a failing of this kind of offerings is there's not many patient voices. I think healthy debate actually does that to get the patient voice in. But I really hate that they only the patients write with the first name, not the whole name. I find that really patronizing. I don't understand why they do it. They ignore my emails about it. But I think that patient voice, the consumer voice, is really important in healthcare, and we have to reflect it. And they do a bad job of it in the media, although much better than we used to. We talk to patients. I was telling a story last night. People were asking me how I got into health reporting, and I started as a general assignment reporter and started covering AIDS protests. And the reason I covered it is because our medical reporter wasn't interested in it. And I remember to this day her saying, why don't you talk to patients? What do they know? And she wasn't being patronizing. She was reflecting the reality of the time. You talk to experts, and you wrote the story, and patients should be thankful for the information you're sharing. Now, there's been a real revolution in that, but it hasn't trickled all the way down into the media. I don't always, maybe you guys discussed this morning, but to me as an outsider, I'm not always clear what the difference is between an evidence network, a conversation, healthy debate. I can kind of see they have little specialties, but I'm not overly clear. I have more concerns about something like a conversation. It strikes me that it's funded by universities. I'm afraid they see it more as a PR adventure than anything else. We're paying, so we want you to promote our researchers. I don't know if that's the reality, but I think that's a issue. I was reading this stuff about the Dalhousie dentistry scandal. I don't know if you remember that. It was back in the news because of the new Dalhousie scandal. And I was wondering if the conversation writes something critical about Dalhousie if Dalhousie paid the bill. And that's a dilemma we've always had in journalism. And you have to really fight hard to retain your independence and keep that independent thought, regardless of your newspaper or providing them. What I'd like to see is someone who reads this stuff quite religiously, things like Evidence Network, is that I think there's a real opportunity to do more backgrounders, and they have good backgrounders. You have good backgrounders, but I don't think they get publicized enough. Enough reporters know about them. People like me who know the background know about them, and that's not the people who need them, unfortunately. I really I remember you guys used to have a Mythbusters series at CFHI, and I really loved that. It was a really great series. Got lots of attention. I think myth-busting is needed more than ever in our media. So I think that's a real opportunity, something you could revive. Give it a new name if you want, to unfake news or something. And the last couple of things I'll say is that, there's a mention of research being publicly funded. And whenever I get an opportunity to speak to researchers, I always talk about that. I think there's an obligation, if you get public funding, to communicate your research to the public. I think there's an inherent social contract there that we don't do a great job. That doesn't mean that every bit of research should be reported in the media. There's a lot of stuff that's not that interesting. It's interesting scientifically, but not socially, and that's fine. I think you have to make the effort and it has to be available. There's a lot of talk in scientific circles about KT, about knowledge translation. And I know that every CFHI grant now has to have a portion of KT funding, or else they won't get money. And a lot of that stuff is done abysmally, to be honest. It's videos of scientists talking incomprehensibly and publishing videos that no one will ever watch. And doing that, that's not knowledge translation. It's checking off the box. I think there's an opportunity there for things like Evidence Network to bridge that gap, to do the KT portion, the some funding from the grants, and do it properly. Actually communicate with people who benefit. And the last thing I'll say, I'll just what Jennifer said, I think is really important, is we're newspapers. We shouldn't call ourselves newspapers anymore. It's not just about the paper. We are exploring all these other documents. Some of you may know that I spend a little bit of time on Twitter each day, a little bit excessively, but that's and I'm encouraged to do that now. I'm not discouraged. I guess we never encourage people in the media. I'm not discouraged. I take that as a free rein, and I abuse it. But we started doing, like the Globe, we started doing these Instagram projects as well. We've done a couple of features on Instagram, and with a really amazing uptake. I haven't done one yet.
A great farm.
Yeah, that was really good. I'm not visually good enough to do that, but I may wade into that in the next year. The data visualizations, I think, are really, really important. I'm always pestering my bosses. We don't do enough of them, but we only go down to 2 artists that we go. So you have a good idea, you give them the information, and they go, yeah, fabulous, but we have 3 other things to do, and report on business takes priority because they still have, so you're not going to get your full. But things like, when you write about screening, screening is a really difficult issue to write about, but you can just put a chart and people go, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Like it's something, and there's many things in health and science that can really be done visually, and they're not imaginative. I'll stop there, and if you have any questions for me, Beth.
Great, yeah, that was just great. Amazing. Thanks, Don. I know there's got to be questions. There's got to be questions. Yes, go ahead, Ivan.
Yes, so thank you. And if there has been, Ivy Bourgeois, University of Ottawa, thank you so much for and I'm a member of Evidence Network, and so I've had this kind of uneasy feeling of creating content and realizing that, what am I doing in terms of creating free content, right? But part of that links back to, I do get public funds for my research. I feel a responsibility to get that out. To an audience, and I also feel as a university professor, I am a public servant of sorts. I mean, lots of university professors don't, realize that or don't think about that, but I am paid, taxpayers' money, and to, provide this information to the public. So there has been that uneasiness, and I think it would be really helpful to kind of extend the conversation about what types of products could we produce that makes it easier for those in the media who aren't in the beat to be able to, get a background, very quickly. So I think, the comment on the backgrounders, I think is really helpful. I was introduced to the issue of listicles, but listicles in more of a backgrounder kind of way, like the group of us who have chairs in gender work and health, we're talking about what are the 5 things that you need to know about gender work and health. So it's a listicle, but it's a form of a backgrounder. And I do want to echo what you're saying, having been very, very recently introduced to Instagram and the power of visuals. And all of the different organizations do that to a greater or lesser extent, to more effectiveness versus less. CFHI has a really great group that does that. And again, there may not be capacity within all of the different organizations, like individually, to do that, but if there's a way that one could share that and then create that platform, because, the memes, connect with people. Very visuals in terms of the infographics that those connect with people. So I think that's another venue. But again, going back to the media, the message, you have to kind of target what type of information for those different types of outlets. Thank you.
I'd say just a couple of things. I think one of the things that academics that don't do well is react quickly. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So, when something's in the news, it's an opportunity, right? We're essentially, like everyone, lazy. Once we start doing a story, we can tend to get our teeth into it and keep doing it. And I always say to people, that's always your opportunity to get in there. So a good example was of doing this well. There's been a debate about where's the abortion pill available. Province, and it's in Canada, it's province by province, gets approved or not. And there was a fight in New Brunswick this week about should it be approved or not. And the Canadian Pharmacists Association published this really great graph about here's where it's available, here's who pays for it. And I think that saved me 5 hours of work, right? I thought that on my Twitter, and I know other people are going to pick it up and all the power to them, but if you're there and quick to give that kind of stuff, it'd be great. You mentioned CFHI. CFHI is good. They package stuff, but there's a lot of politics behind CFHI that we don't talk about, right? What they don't publish is just as important what they do publish. So I think something like Evidence Network could take CFHI data and recut it in different ways. They publish their classic pie of here's the big spending category, and I always say there's a lot of pieces of pie missing there, like home care is not in there, how much does nursing cost, things like that, and all that data is there, but it's a lot of work to recut it. But that's a real opportunity to do background, which is different framing of data that's publicly available, but recut it and reframe it. I think you get a lot of attention and it's really useful. And the background is, it's about making them more known so that people who don't know the topic know where to find it. And the Canadian Science Media Centre that does that with less health stuff, more science stuff, a lot of climate change, et cetera. And they do a good job. They've run out of funding too.
One interesting thing that we find a policy options is that we'll approach somebody who's done really interesting research and ask them, can they give us a shorter version? And our versions are still long. We still go 1,200 and 2,000 words of time. And we sometimes get the response that, well, you're not peer reviewed, so I'm not going to waste my time on this. And again, I have all the time in the world for peer-reviewed research. The Institute does peer-reviewed research. But sometimes you'll have a much wider impact, including with policymakers, if that's what your objective is to change something down the line, if your pieces are written in a more accessible format. So I'm not quite sure how to address that in a wider sense and to convince people that I think maybe some of the responsibility maybe of the universities to start talking about knowledge translation and different forms of writing. Yeah. So actually Shannon and I are going to do a whole webinar on writing op-eds.
How to write an op-ed.
Yeah. And Sherry Graydon does this in her work with informed opinions for women researchers and so on. And from what I understand, public policy schools are talking more about this, but I don't have a great sense of, in the wider university community, whether this is a conversation that's being had that people are having about, okay, yes, you can write your thesis and you can write for journals, but can you write for a whole other market?
Yeah. I think the problem with universities is they don't value that stuff.
That's right.
They
say they do.
No, yeah, but they don't. Like you get judged on your peer reviews. I just at a Picard conference where we talked about this. It's a great social media campaign. It doesn't have to hurt. And that researcher lost her funding because she didn't have enough peer reviews. And this is a thing that's gone global, viral globally, real impact on practically on patients, and it gets seen as no value within the university. So they've got to kind of get out of the 1950s as well with the way they view.
Oh God, they're not even the 1950s.
Yeah,
I've tried a medieval institution before, but it was very interesting because I had this conversation with Jonathan Lomas when he was heading up CHSRF when I was a postdoc, and they were providing us with these like how-tos, how to write op-eds, how to engage in the media, like 20 years ago. And I was going, oh, this is all great, but you know what? I'm not going to get tenure based on this. And so we had this conversation, and he actually did research. He had a summer student contact people, and it's right at the bottom, absolutely at the bottom. And things haven't changed that much. I mean, the reason why people like Colleen and I do this is, we've got tenure as full professors, and so what's happening to, the younger people, and they're becoming incredibly concerned about, it's not just clicks, but, your age factor and like how many people are citing your stuff and that sort of thing. So it's very challenging.
Yes, go ahead, Sheila.
Shannon Maloney from Canada Health and OA. A couple of things, and maybe just picking up on the conversation we just had. I think one of the things we all have good information. I think we all think we're experts in our subjects in which we are engaged and employed. And I think you get to the point about there's so much competition and there's so much information out there. We just did a myth-busting campaign, 17 myths in 17 weeks. The myth, the fact, the recent Canadian source, infographics, tweets, articles, and it was well picked up, but it wasn't great. So I guess my question to you is, and I think that's always our challenge. We've got this great amount of information. How do we get it out there in bite-sized chunks? How do we most influence? How do we have the message impact? And how do we get it to people like you? And Jennifer, you referred to finding your experts. How do you get on the expert list? How do we, demonstrate that we're experts? Or how do you choose your experts? How do you know who's an expert?
Well, people write to me every day, and there's not a huge proportion I turn down. I look into who they are and what their background is, and but sometimes it's just, as simple as sending an email and saying, would you be interested in a piece on X? And and then in terms of expanding the reach on different issues, in a weird way, I find that Andre's the exception because he's really big on Twitter, but I like to think that when you get an article published in Policy Options, you put a huge amount of firepower into promoting it. Whereas I find the big organizations they tweet it once and that's about it, and there's no personal, you give a personal touch. Like when you tweet something, you're saying, I find this interesting, you should read it. Yeah, and so as editor, I sometimes tweet the same article 3-4 times, and then people like Andre and Bob and I have pretty wide networks of other people who have equally large networks, and that's where I find that you can quickly expand the reach of articles. And it's weird, like I said before, it's like lighting up just like different cities of interest. So to bring back on the Indigenous file again, there are a lot of Indigenous activists and groups and researchers, academics on Twitter. This is a world that you work in as well. And so I find that it's interesting how you can have an article shared very quickly by recognizing where readers are and sharing with specific people. Sometimes I send direct messages to people saying, hey, you might be interested in this, and then they twig to it. Not everyone's on Twitter all day long, looking at their feed.
No.
So we tag people or we nudge them to say, in case you missed this. I'll tweet things like 2 days later saying, maybe you didn't read this. And this is also why we have a newsletter, because we recognize that people don't read every single thing we publish every day. This is a big thing in the media now, our newsletters, so that you get re-clicks on your articles. So.
I can attest that Jennifer's not that picky. She published me earlier this year. Basically, the thing is, it's always about seeking opportunities and doing what Andre described, which is that an issue came up and immediately there was information available from a source, a credible source, because that source was smart enough and on the ball enough to get that out there and see that opportunity. I guess the question is, do you have your network, or do you have your organization, or you're working with an organization like Evidence Network that's seeking out those opportunities? Because your priorities are not necessarily going to be the priorities of various media that may repeat or run material that you produce. It's really a question of whether you can fit in with, do some of your own promotion, but can you also fit in with the other things that are going on, the public discussions that are going on, the point where the legislative process might be in various provinces or the federal government, this kind of thing. Like, how do you fit into the bigger public debate? And that's being a bit more proactive than simply producing something.
Hi, thanks for that. I was just reflecting on your comments, Andre, about the paywall and thinking about the most of the stuff that we produce as researchers basically goes behind some kind of paywall as well. Some circumstances not, but we try to get it outside of those environments by putting it on SSRN and then they went for that. Or you have to somehow come up with so much money to put it on a free kind of place. Just the amount of money that you have to come up with is astounding for something like the CMAJ or something like that. So I think this paywall business might need a little bit more exploration depending on the bits that kind of go into the production function. And just occurred to me as I was thinking about it, that part of the problem as well is that while Evidence Network is great and the work that you all three do and others is great, that there's still this ginormous reservoir of information that is inside the universities and other similar kinds of institutions that you have no idea about. And partly because you don't have access to our databases, and you may do if you're an adjunct professor. You can't get in. So maybe part of this is that we should also be figuring out how to storm the barricades the other way as well, rather, Evidence Network's sort of trying to help us get it out, but there's a few of us foot soldiers in there. Maybe it should be coming the other way too.
I think that would change quickly if universities started valuing different things. To me, the impact factor that matters is you have an impact on the public, right? And that's not valued anywhere in university.
Right.
So if that's changed, that would open floodgates pretty quickly.
I'll just back up from that. So the reason why universities don't value this is not because universities are medieval or it's because governments in turn do not pay universities for this. They barely pay them to teach. Right? The money that we get is so loaded tied up with research funding grants and these kinds of things. That's how we get money. That's why we're obsessed with getting research funding grants. Barely obsessed with teaching. Teaching is just sort of something to do on the side, let alone KT. So I think when you're thinking about this problem, it's actually a bigger problem. And we're all chasing our tails after a little bit of money, provincial and federal, in education, another op-ed, perhaps.
Hi, I'm Vivian from the Ontario Medical and you also mentioned how difficult it was to get an alternative voice on the table.
Louder? Speak louder, please. Speak louder.
Okay. So, Mr. Picard, I really liked what you said about needing a more reflective and representative also how difficult it is to get alternative voices at that table. I guess, my own voice will be considered an alternative voice, being a woman in minority culture. And I guess I just wonder how practical steps make space for people who don't necessarily have that space. So Indigenous people team up, LGBT team up as well. And so how do we practically facilitate that so that there being an alternative voice of teachers, mine and others, can be
Practical ways that are getting diverse.
I think the first one is talking about it, right? Being aware of it, and I think that's changed in our op-ed use. I think is an act, especially for outside contributors, because as I explained, we have the internal problem of not being able to hire new people. So I think the awareness is really key. And I think you mentioned informed ops. A group like that, I think they give really good seminars, and they can give you better advice than I could on. They're all about amplifying the woman's voice. They have a great Twitter campaign going on now called Amplify Her. So you look at that, and they do seminars on real practical tips. And part of it is, just encouraging women to put yourself forward and do what men do. Like, be full of yourself and say, of course I'm an expert on this. So I read a book about it. A lot of it is, a lot of experts are self-claimed experts, right? A lot of that is, it's starts in our schools, giving girls more confidence and giving them a platform and not shooting them down and not dismissing them. All this stuff is, doesn't change all the time, but a lot of this practical stuff, get in there, and there's a willingness to do it, but you have to make it easier for the editors. Again, as Bob said, there's very little staff now, so anything to make their lives easier will make it easier to get those voices.
I'm going to ask the woman on the panel what her view is on that. Well, I'll talk about diversity in general. I find that when I got this job where I'm the boss and I can ask whoever I want to contribute on any issue, that it became way easier than I thought to diversify our roster of contributors. It's a matter of asking. It's a matter of looking for people that come from different walks of life. When I plan a special issue, I pay a lot of attention to how many women are speaking, especially if it's an issue on like foreign affairs or security, which is very male-dominated. So as I mentioned, we're having a series on peacekeeping policy. There are a lot of women that are experts in peacekeeping, but you don't really hear them in television panels or so on. And so I think it takes, not trying to say this from a point of conceit, but I think it takes just a little bit more effort, but not much, not much more effort to diversify the voices. And as I said before, I think there's a tendency in the media that I really don't like, which is to have people opine on issues before they ask people who are actually affected by them to opine on them. And so if I take this week in particular around Quebec Law 62 or Bill 62 on religious faith covering and people getting public services, the reflex is to have all our top national reporters speak about it, but I want to hear what Muslim women think about it. That's my first thing is we're talking about somebody and they have zero voice. And that's one of the things that I think that is a good thing that's changing in the media, because people are poking at that on social media and newsrooms are paying attention. And so now you actually see that there's in the big newspapers, there is a push to diversify who the voices are. They don't get full-time jobs necessarily, but they're more contractual people that are being asked to write opinion pieces or write op-eds and so on. So there is a change there that's happening. I don't know if that's exactly what you wanted to hear to talk about, but yeah.
I would add one more thing, is that some of your worst enemies are your own institution. When I call up the PR people, who are they offering me? I said, if I need an expert on diabetes, does it have to be the man who's been publishing on diabetes for 45 years? Or could it be someone else? There has to be some expert internally. And I often have these discussions with PR. Yeah, we've talked to him 80 times. Maybe someone else in the university knows something about this who's not old and white like we use it. And I think a lot of that has to work on mobile.
I think our communications people are trying to get in Karen. Karen has a question. Okay. Karen has a question from remote. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you to this fabulous panel, and thanks again for facilitating my remote participation. I really enjoyed listening to this terrific panel. I had a question about investigative journalism. I mean, you've certainly all painted a picture of really the changing landscape, but, I think we are seeing a lot of really terrific cutting-edge investigative journalism. I'm thinking about, the reporting even today from the Toronto Star on mother risk, and would be really interested in the panel's comments on how, beyond how experts here fit in, with this investigative journalism environment. Thanks.
Yeah, you haven't really seen too much to the extent of where you see a little bit more in the United States, where you see actual collaborations between sort of university-based or academic-based think tanks, this sort of thing, working directly with journalistic organizations to do investigations. Andre might go there. You haven't really seen that here in Canada very much, have you?
Not the way like there's pro-publican.
Yeah. And so I sometimes think about this and how a university itself could help. Would be, has a university ever said, look, we will actually set up a foundation to try and accomplish this goal of doing public interest journalism, of doing public interest research on topics that are of public relevance. And such a thing doesn't really exist in Canada. So could you even raise money for that kind of foundation? Possibly, quite possibly. But that's the kind of next. I think you'd need a structure like that in order to accomplish maybe what you're talking about. Because, of course, as we pointed out here a number of times already, the resources are less now than they used to be. And as Andre said, even an organization as influential and as large as Globe Mail does a couple of projects a year. So is there a way of going to the kind of model you've seen more in the United States? I guess it's a question. I don't have an answer to it.
Okay, so I think Heidi had her hand up too, and you're okay?
There was just a very, very quick comment to build on what Colleen was saying. If we look internationally, because we do have some representatives of funders here and some of the other organizations also fund research, and universities will shift if external actors that they engage in start asking different questions and putting different requirements on the university. So, all of the funding from the European Research Commission, from the EU, requires that everything that is published does not go behind a paywall. So we haven't seen that shift here as of yet, but it is putting different requirements upon universities to make sure that information is out in the public.
I wonder if there's any conversation that's happening with the journals that are published in Canada. So I know the public, I have a communication with the public policy journal, and they happily will lift the paywall so that you can publish an item that's based on something that appeared there, but I don't know in the health realm whether.
I know that open access is becoming a big debate, yes, absolutely, within our university specifically, but yeah, this is ongoing.
We're allowed to put it in our funding proposals, but then our funding proposals get cut off as needs, and so that would be the first thing that goes.
Yeah.
Could be an absolute requirement, whereas, the funding organizations could say, and there are lots of different types of funding organizations around the table here, not just the Tri-Council, could say, whatever you produce absolutely has to be in the public domain, and it could be like a budget line that will not get touched.
But is it not, because I see some shirk proposals, and it seems to me that they always mention safety at some point, or impact, or is that not part of?
It is part of it, but frankly, as it comes down to it, it doesn't matter when it comes to promotion, and promotion and merit is how you get paid. So they will talk the game, as both of you pointed out this morning, they will talk the game, but it will not make a difference when it comes to merit and promotion. The other thing we've talked about in our research department is it will make a difference, though, if the president of the university or the VP research says things like, I noticed that you had a piece in the Globe and Mail, and I wanted to congratulate you, and you put that little letter into your tenure and promotion file and use that as a way of getting attention. But it still isn't being taken seriously in terms of, oh, wow, you did a really good job in branding us today. Thank you very much. They heard about you. And also just in terms of increasing your collaboration abilities. There's somebody over here who had their hand up before Stephanie, though. Okay, Stephanie, go ahead then. I'm sorry.
I want to pick back up on the diversity discussion. It's so interesting because I'm from Heart and Stroke. And Andre, you said, you use us as an example, but we're always giving out the same experts. And from our seat, it's interesting because we're always pushed to offer doctors and medical doctors. And so we always, in our campaigns, offer the patient voice. And that does make it into softer stories, but not necessarily news stories, some of them. But if I want to offer up another expert who isn't a medical doctor, and I offer up two experts, and one's a medical doctor and one's like a policy expert, 9 times out of 10 they're going to go with the medical doctor. So it's interesting that just from our perspective that seems to be what media wants.
They're biased, then.
Yeah.
Biased, eh?
Yeah. And even like somebody with a PhD, I actually will say they're a doctor because they are a doctor. I won't say they're not a medical doctor. And I just let it go because that's going to get me an interview.
Well, you're dying of a heart attack We can't help you, but we can tell you about the expense and the public policy behind it.
I'll tell you that much right
So
now.
is there still a bias in media towards
Yeah, there is.
doctors, towards credentials?
Yeah, I'd say it's more ignorance. I think it's just like the public. They know you're a doctor, therefore you know everything about health. But again, I think a lot of that comes from internally within organizations and universities. Again, the hard example, but diabetes. Why not afford a diabetes nurse? They actually do all the work, right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's incumbent on the organizations to push back and say, yeah, we have a doctor, but a lot, and access is what matters to the nurse is much more available, and she'll, you can get a picture with her too. There's ways of selling it.
I think I'm going to let the last question go to Colleen.
It was just more a comment about getting people, researchers to do KT. And the researchers, faculty don't have a lot of time about what they absolutely have to do. And so this makes it very difficult. And then many of them, they might be interested, but they really don't have the skill set to do it. And sort of forcing everybody to do it, which is now the SHRC and CFHI route, I think it's stupid. Because many people are just hopeless at this, and you will never be able to get them into a space. And it becomes a sort of cynical thing when they write up the, 6 bodies by Sunday, how they're going to do KT, which they have no intention of actually doing, or capacity. And they've just borrowed the language from somewhere and they've stuck it in. So I do think that modalities like we're talking about here, you need brokers. You need different mechanisms, push and pulls in between, the Canadian Foundation for Information Improvement, whatever it's called now. It used to be CHSRF, sorry, but that's still what it is in my mind. That used to do a lot more of that. And I think we need more structures like that. I mean, there will be some folks in university who have that kind of ilk, like they're interested in it and they sort of are really committed to it and they're going to probably do it anyway. But others, this is silly to sort of force them. So I kind of feel like, is there ways to sort of be able to let the media and others sort of tap into the fruits of university research without sort of forcing the researchers to be the ones to kind of parlay their wares all up and down the country? Like, I don't know. This is why you get the bad science videos.
Yeah, no, I think you said the key word, brokers. Knowledge translation doesn't necessarily have to be the scientists. It's getting the scientists research out there. And brokers like Evidence Network and others are the way to do it.
Well, I'm sure you would like to thank this wonderful panel for
You've been listening to a podcast from EvidenceNetwork.ca, making evidence matter in Canadian health policy. Connect with the latest non-partisan health research from experts across Canada and around the world, or sign up to receive our free monthly e-newsletter at www.EvidenceNetwork.ca. You can also subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. EvidenceNetwork.ca is funded by the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Research Manitoba, and the University of Winnipeg.